Welcome back. I'm Brian Becker. We're having a special interview here in our Washington, D.C. studio with Andy Worthington, British journalist, the author of the Guantanamo Files, one of the key promoters of the true narrative of what's gone on at Guantanamo, what's gone on since 2001. Andy Worthington, welcome.
Hello.
Thank you.
Very nice to be here.
You're here in Washington, D.C. because this is an anniversary, perhaps not a very happy anniversary. Tell us what's going on.
It's the it's the 10th anniversary of the opening of the War on Terror prison at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. I was here last year for the 9th anniversary of its opening. I'm here on this occasion again. You know, some of the people that I'm with, we're starting to say we must stop meeting like this. But sadly, you know, there's no imminent sign of the prison closing. And of course, that's a very depressing situation to be in 3 years after President Obama promised to close it within a year.
Yeah, you're here in addition to marking the anniversary. I understand you're speaking around the country. Where are you going and who are you intending to speak to?
Well, I started off last week. I was in New York and I did a few events there. I arrived in D.C. on Monday, the 9th of January. Did some events on the 10th, had a panel discussion at the New America Foundation with Tom Wilner, who was a lawyer who represented Guantanamo prisoners in the Supreme Court, with Colonel Morris Davis, who was the former chief prosecutor of the military commissions at Guantanamo, who turned against it when he was asked to use information derived through the use of torture, which he wouldn't do. Has become a great spokesman against the injustice of the whole regime, actually. And Congressman Jim Moran came along as well. To express his support for the desire to close Guantanamo, which was a good sign at the start of an election year when we're going to see people not want to talk about these issues.
You know, after a while, certain words become sort of iconographic in a way, and they, in a way, lose their meaning, like Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib. What happened at Guantanamo, and what's still happening? And then I want to talk about why it's still open.
Okay. Well, you know, Guantanamo is really the icon of Bush's war on terror. I mean, it's part of a network of other prisons that involved and still involves, really, detentions in Afghanistan. It did involve detentions in Iraq when that came in. And it involved, at one point, this secret network of prisons run by the CIA, and also prisons where other people were sent to other countries where they were tortured on behalf of the CIA. Those were the facilities in Syria and in Egypt and in Morocco and in Jordan. And Guantanamo was some of those people ended up in Guantanamo. I mean, several dozen of those people ended up in Guantanamo, having been through various other secret prisons. Most of the people were processed through the prisons in Afghanistan, Kandahar and Bagram, and then sent on to Guantanamo. Most of them were picked up in Afghanistan or Pakistan. Pakistan clearly not actually at the battlefield. They were picked up at a time when the United States military was offering substantial bounty payments to its allies in Afghanistan and Pakistan, for whom an average of $5,000 a head in a bounty was a lot of money. The most official high-level statement came from President Musharraf of Pakistan. In his autobiography, he said, in exchange for handing over hundreds of terror suspects, we received millions of dollars. That's pretty direct. The orders also came from the administration not to screen these prisoners according to the Geneva Conventions, as happened in every other military conflict, or certainly for decades. And that involves what are called competent tribunals. So if you're capturing people who are not part of a recognized army, they're not wearing a uniform led by a general, you screen them because you capture all kinds of people in wartime. You capture people passing through a war zone, you know. And in the first Gulf War, about 1,200 of these tribunals were held, and in 3/4 of the cases, the military realized they'd got the wrong people and sent them home. Now, they were preparing to do this in Afghanistan in December 2001, and the orders came from Rumsfeld, presumably. And I would think with the blessing of Dick Cheney. We're not screening anyone for anything. We're treating everyone as though they're guilty
the presumption of guilt as opposed to the presumption of innocence.
Yeah.
And during the Bush era, when the Bush administration lost all of the popular support and sympathy that America enjoyed on September 12, 2001, when there was an outpouring of sympathy after the attacks, within a few years, and maybe a few months, in fact, the United States started to have a different reputation. Torture, Inc., recognized by the United Nations. Guantanamo was a torture center, I believe. And when President Obama came in 2009, there was not only a sense that Bush was leaving, but that the Bush era was ending. And first and foremost amongst people's perception was that Guantanamo would close, and the president indeed promised, almost as his first act, that it would close, but it's still open. Will it close, and why is it still open?
You know, I would very much hope that eventually it will close, because otherwise the men who are held there will die. You know, 1, 2, 3 next year, 5 the next year, who knows? It will go on for years and years. There will be no way out for any of these people. I think we've reached such a difficult position that we now have to start to say to people with a position of power and responsibility in the government that you will be judged on this as your legacy. It will not look good in the history books, the failure to close this prison, because we really have to go back to the founding of it, that, you know, the very premise of the war on terror was the Bush administration didn't want to hold soldiers according to the Geneva Conventions, didn't want to hold terror suspects as criminals, wanted to bundle them all together, hold them as illegal enemy combatants, essentially an invented concept where people had absolutely no rights. You know, that was the intention, and that was actually the reality for the first.
No rights, no evidence presented against them, no trial, no due process.
No, absolutely nothing. I mean, no way out of being trapped in this black hole. You know, which is why when eventually that was broken through by the Supreme Court in 2004, in June 2004, in Rasool v. Bush, the habeas corpus case, the Supreme Court took the unprecedented step of granting habeas corpus rights to prisoners seized in wartime. You wouldn't do that if they were protected by the Geneva Conventions, because that allows you, mandates you to hold them till the end of hostilities. You have to hold them humanely. And it was because the Bush administration was obsessed with obtaining intelligence rather than with detention. And when they didn't think they were getting the intelligence that they wanted, with not having any rules to prevent them from treating these prisoners in whatever ways they thought were appropriate. And that's where the torture came in, because they weren't listening to their law enforcement interrogation experts who were telling them, don't do it. Not just because it's illegal, but because you will get some things that are true and so many lies, and then you're going to waste all your resources.
People lie just to stop the pain, to stop the torture.
Absolutely.
And I want to ask you also, you spoke a moment ago about the preoccupation with intelligence, but wasn't it also true that some of the torture seemed to be coinciding with the Bush administration's efforts to present public evidence that would justify the attack on Iraq? In other words, wasn't some of that waterboarding and some of the other actions, the cruel, sadistic terror tactics used against people incarcerated, designed to get them to say whatever the U.S. government wanted them to say? Well,
to a certain extent, yes. I mean, it's, you know, I think obviously at the beginning they had this notion that there may be other attacks, and they wanted to deal with that. I mean, a couple of years ago, I spoke to Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who was the chief of staff to Colin Powell, you know, who's been very public in saying they were cut out of the dealings in the war on terror that were made by the decisions that were made by a small group around Dick Cheney.
The State Department was cut out.
The State Department was cut out of that, and that, you know, he said, you know, he'd been talking to people over the years and gradually understanding that this perceived threat of another attack was something that diminished fairly swiftly, and that at that point exactly there was a motivation on the part of, particularly I think of Vice President Dick Cheney, to push for intelligence that would justify the invasion of Iraq. And the key piece of evidence there is the rendition to Egypt and the torture, and I believe waterboarding was used on a man called Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi, who was the emir of a training camp in Afghanistan that was not an al-Qaeda training camp. He was captured, he was rendered to Egypt. When he was tortured there, he claimed that two al-Qaeda operatives were meeting with Saddam Hussein to discuss obtaining chemical and biological weapons.
He said that under the conditions of enhanced interrogation or torture?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, he was being tortured by the Egyptians. Whether the CIA were in the room or whether they were just, receiving the reports, probably from Omar Suleiman, Mubarak's, right-hand man. Whichever one it was, they were getting this information. Now, al-Libi, recanted those statements, but Colin Powell wasn't told. And Colin Powell used this information in his presentation to the UN the month before the invasion of Iraq.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of what I was getting at, is that Colin Powell went before the UN. He wasn't part of the neoconservative wing of the Bush administration. Thus, he had some credibility.
Absolutely, yeah.
And he was the one who sold the need to go to war, basically, the need for authorization to carry out military force, because Iraq was definitively having biological, chemical, and other weapons of mass destruction. And that evidence, partly, was based on the torture of rendered prisoners, in this case al-Libi, who then ended up in Libya, where Human Rights Watch investigators, I believe, met him. And then what happened?
Well, yeah, al-Libi, from what I understand, and and a few years ago, I spoke to a Libyan friend who had spoken to someone who had been in prison with al-Libi, and al-Libi had apparently reported that he'd been taken around various other secret prisons run by or on behalf of the CIA, where he'd been tortured, and where the familiar pattern developed. It was used everywhere. They had what they called the family album. So they had photos of prisoners in all their detention facilities, which they showed. I think that's the root of so much of the supposed evidence, is that under very dubious circumstances, you're showing people photos and saying, tell me what you know about this person, tell me what you know. And then when they finally had finished with him, they sent him back to Libya. He was not the only one. There were at least half a dozen Libyans who had been in CIA custody who were rendered back to the not-so-tender mercies of Colonel Gaddafi. So he was imprisoned in the notorious Abu Salim prison in Tripoli with other political prisoners, probably for about 3 years. And at that point, researchers from Human Rights Watch were allowed to go to Libya, were allowed to come to the prison. They interviewed some of the other prisoners other Libyans who'd been held by US forces and tortured in Bagram, in other black sites. And they spoke to al-Libi, but only to the extent that al-Libi said that he didn't want to talk to them because of what the Americans had done to him. And then, I think it was less than 2 months after that visit, al-Libi conveniently committed suicide in his prison cell and died, thereby removing, an embarrassment for the Libyan government, the United States government, and the Egyptian government, which had tortured him and then had him publicly recant what.
And he had also been at Guantanamo, correct?
Al-Libi, to my knowledge, had never been at Guantanamo. It's possible that al-Libi was moved to Guantanamo. There was a short period, I think, from September 2003 to March 2004, when the secret prison in Poland essentially closed. They moved them to a secret facility within Guantanamo for 6 months. And then when it began to become apparent that they were going to lose the Supreme Court case, Rasool v. Bush, that the prisoners were going to get habeas corpus rights in June 2004, in March 2004, they moved them back to a network of prisons that involved Lithuania and Romania and Morocco. Now, this is people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Abu Zubaydah, the high-value detainees that many people have heard of. Whether al-Libi was part of that group, I don't know. He may have been.
Let me go on to another subject, because the time is going quickly. Guantanamo is in Cuba. I mean, do you know of any other instance where a country like the United States, is able to take people it captures from all around the world and send them to a facility, a detention camp, a prison, or what the UN calls a torture center, openly though, not a secret prison, to another country, and then is able to exercise a degree of sovereignty over that prison. The host country has no control over it, and yet the United States says, well, because they're there, they're no longer subject to U.S. rules of justice, due process, evidence, and so on. Is there anything like it anywhere in the world that you're aware of? And also, just for our international listeners, why is Guantanamo in Cuba under the control of the United States?
Okay, well, I mean, it's, the United States got control of that Guantanamo Bay site, during the battles in Cuba at the end of the 19th century. A lease was agreed that the United States could keep it, which I think was in the 1930s, and the lease can only be broken when both sides agree to it. So the Cubans don't want it, but they can't break the lease. They'd have to go to war with America, which they're not going to do. My understanding is that there isn't another foreign base quite where the situation is the same, because I think it's the only foreign base where the United States government doesn't have active diplomatic relations with the government who actually owns that land, which I'm sure is why they chose it, because they could nominally say that it was Cuban. The Cubans were not involved at all in having any say about the statement that the United States had made while washing its hands of responsibility, whereas, in fact, of course, absolutely everything that took place there is the decisions are made by the United States. It's effectively a part of the United States. So that's why they chose it when they wanted somewhere, because they wanted somewhere outside the reach of the law. What they had for 2.5 years until they got the Supreme Court decision giving them men habeas corpus rights, it allowed attorneys in. That broke the spell of silence that was required.
I mean, no one knew the names of the prisoners. Their families didn't know if they had been captured, that they were at Guantanamo. Nobody knew anything. This was just people who had been captured and, as you said, put in a black hole.
Yeah, absolutely. And, nobody knew who the people were held, officially who was held there for over 4 years, until the Pentagon lost lawsuits filed by media groups and had to release the names and nationalities of all the prisoners and a whole load of 7,000 or 8,000 pages of documents relating to them. That's where my work began, that I was researching and writing, and it's been the basis of my work ever since, to understand who these people are, based largely on the documents produced, made available under duress by the U.S. government. And so we ended up with this position where the Bush administration, having established a lawless place, then disposed of prisoners in an essentially, extra-legal manner, that although the prisoners had these habeas rights, that Congress then tried to take them away. They were reinstated by the Supreme Court in June 2008. But mostly the way that President Bush dealt with this abomination he'd created was to release people through diplomatic means. And when President Obama came in, and it looked like, he said on his second day in office, he issued an executive order saying he was going to close it. He could have acted really swiftly, but he didn't. He set up a interagency task force to review all the prisoners' cases. And they essentially started looking at it more from a kind of law enforcement position, and hovering over it all the time, this fear of, what if we release the wrong person? And the terrible thing about it, about not having boldness about it, is, for the most part, the people held at Guantanamo are a collection of nobodies. Now, intelligence estimates over the years, serious intelligence estimates, have suggested a few dozen of those people have an involvement with international terrorism, or may have. Everybody else is either, innocent people seized by mistake, or lowly foot soldiers fighting for the Taliban against the Northern Alliance, that had nothing to do with the United States until after 9/11, the United States invades and these people suddenly become enemies of the US. The whole process of manufacturing intelligence and extracting these statements and confessions from people in Guantanamo is meant to make them all seem more important than they are. You know, somebody's put under pressure somewhere, says, yeah, he was involved in a plot. Suddenly he's a terrorist. All of it, most of that, is just rubbish. And yet, the Obama administration had the ability to come in and to robustly say, most of this is rubbish, most of these guys should be out of here. And they hesitated. They set these processes in place to review them. And by that, and you know, within a very short amount of time, Republicans had worked out that they could play the fear card on the American people. You need to be scared, these guys are terrorists. Democrats, you know, found that their backbone had gone missing because it's a whole situation of really keeping the American people scared and invoking Guantanamo and terrorism to do that.
You were key in bringing to public light the case of certain citizens of the UK and residents, legal residents of the UK who were in Guantanamo. Tell us just a little bit about them, just briefly, and also the United States and Britain have been partners, even though the United States has been the lead force in the so-called war on terror, endless war. Talk about them and talk about the role of the UK here.
Okay, well, I mean, my interest in obviously, for people living in Britain, I think the British prisoners were people where it was easy for British people to understand that something strange was happening in Guantanamo. And one of the cases that I really got behind and was able to report on while it was happening was the case of Binyam Mohammed, who was a British resident who had been captured in Pakistan, had been tortured in Pakistan, had then been rendered to Morocco, where he was tortured, and then taken to a secret facility in Afghanistan, and then ended up in Guantanamo. A horrible, sordid story of extraordinary rendition and torture going on here. How much did the British know? How much were the British involved? And, you know, that was...
Did they object? Did the British government stand up for its citizen and its residents?
No, they didn't. And that was what was interesting, because his lawyers managed to find a way of getting the High Court in the UK to look at the case, and got the case in front of a couple of judges who, you know, took their legal obligations very seriously and were appalled to discover that the British government had been involved in. They described it as wrongdoing, but they meant wrongdoing in quite a heavy way. They understood that what they were talking about was complicity in torture, and it was very satisfying to see that the law could be upheld objectively by people who refused to be politicized by saying, "Oh, we're facing a terrible terrorist threat. It's all understandable," and it actually helped to get Binyam Mohammed home. It helped to make sure that more people in Britain understood that the United States had had no closer ally, I think, in the war on terror than the British, who had helped with the sharing of intelligence, with the rendition of prisoners, with essentially turning a blind eye when, or being involved when their resident was being moved around by US forces. And it's something that I think is disappointing. It's very disappointing about President Obama that he has absolutely shut every door on any legal challenge to what took place under the Bush administration regarding rendition and torture. He's made sure that there is no way that a torture victim, or let's say an alleged torture victim, can get into a US courtroom and have their case heard. And so what happened in Britain was a good sign for the British justice system, but it reflects very badly on what's been happening in the United States when you compare and contrast it.
I want to ask you about that issue of accountability. President Obama said, let's move forward, not backward. People interpreted that as a political decision rather than a legal decision. But torture is illegal. It's illegal by the U.S. law. It's illegal by international law. It's banned, and you can give it another name, enhanced interrogation technique, or whatever, but torture is torture. And I'm wondering if you view it as an expert, as the author of the Guantanamo Files, who's done so much to reveal what's going on there, whether there's kind of two tiers of justice and accountability where other governments who the United States is targeting or lecturing, they say, well, you must adhere to the rule of law. And of course, the rule of law is important because otherwise people can do anything without consequences. Why isn't there prosecution? Why isn't there indictment? And do you feel that there is the potential, as happened to Pinochet, the Chilean dictator, for instance, after a number of years, the tenacious efforts of Chilean and other international human rights workers led to his final arrest? Is it possible?
Well, you have to say, I have to say that I hope that it's possible. These things, and that's a good example, and I think what happened in Argentina as well, that it's taken decades. Those are good indications that these things are not going to happen overnight. I think it's enormously significant that the Obama administration refused to deal with it, and that the trick that was played by senior lawyers in the Bush administration, who gave them the cover, was that they said torture isn't torture. They redefined torture and then said you can go ahead and use it. And that included claiming that waterboarding, which the Spanish Inquisition called it tortura del agua. They were honest back then. The United States government claimed that it wasn't torture, that enhanced interrogation was a way of getting round that. It was all about cover. And the problem is that there was an investigation in the Department of Justice, which went on for 4 years, into whether these lawyers had deliberately been guilty of professional misconduct. And that was a very critical report, which I think would have opened the door to accountability. Well, a kind of senior fixer within the DOJ was allowed to overwrite the rulings and say, no, they just demonstrated poor judgment, which is not something that can be followed up. It's just a, slap on the back of the hand, oh dear. And he said, everybody was under a lot of pressure. You've got to understand. You've got to understand, given what had happened, people made mistakes. And, that's a very high-level refusal to deal with it. What it has allowed to do, I think we can see, if you listen to, the way that the right-wing pundits and some of their supporters talk about torture, talk about this macho approach to keeping America safe, talking about, we've had GOP candidates talk about waterboarding, wanting to waterboard. This has all been allowed to happen because for whatever reasons, and some of them may be understandable politically, torture has not been thoroughly repudiated within the United States, and it needs to be. And you can't repudiate it, I don't think, without holding people accountable. So in the long run, I don't think that we're going to that we're going to be able to end up in a place where we can say the United States understands that what took place was wrong without there being some process of accountability.
We're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank you. We're joined by Andy Worthington. He's the author of the Guantanamo Files, an international truth teller, and of course, the people in the United States need to hear this first and foremost. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. We'll see you next time.
Okay.